Hi, good evening, everyone. Boa noite, buenas tardes, bonsoir. Welcome todas, todes, todos. My name is Rodrigo Moura, and I'm the Chief Curator at El Museo del Barrio. And it is my pleasure to welcome each one of you tonight for another public program of Estamos Bien, La Trienal 2021. El Museo's year-long initiative. Tonight we are here to celebrate the launch of The Wall by artist Michael Menchaca. To mark this special occasion, we're excited to present a conversation between artists Michael Menchaca and curator Claudia Zapata. Michael Menchaca was born in 1905 in San Antonio, Texas, and received his BFA from Texas University in 2011, and his MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2015. He's been an artist in residence and several different art centers in the United States. Also, he has exhibited his work in different museums, such as the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Arkansas, the McNay Art Museum in Texas, the Davis Museum, North Carolina Museum, among several others. He was a visual arts fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center from 2015 and 16. And he's a recipient of the 2018 National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Fund for the Arts grant. Thank you for being with us tonight, Michael. Claudia Zapata is a doctoral candidate in the PhD program in art history of the Southern Methodist University's RASCA, Rhetoric of Art, Space and Culture. She received her BA and MA in art history from University of Texas at Austin, specializing at classic Maya art. Her research interests include curatorial methodologies of identity-based exhibitions, Chicanx and Latinx art, digital humanities, people of color zines, and designer toys, all topics of big interest for the program tonight. Zapata has curated several exhibitions at the Mexican Art Museum in Austin and other Texas institutions, including Aviva Voz, Carmen Lomas Garza in 2009, and Fantastic and Grotesque, Jose Clemente Orozco in print, 2014. She has published articles in several journals and is currently pursuing her dissertation project, Chicano Art is Not Dead, Politics on Display within Major US Exhibitions. From 2018 to 20, Claudia is the Latinx Art Curatorial Assistant at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in support of the exhibition Printing the Revolution, The Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now, where also Michael is participating, and we'll be talking about that tonight. I'm also joined by the Trienal co-curators, my dear colleagues, guest curator and New York-based artist Elia Alba, and El Museo's curator Susanna Temkin, who will be moderating our panel tonight. The Wall is a video installation by Michael Menchaca, reconceived for the virtual space as a standalone website. And a big thanks goes to Lisette Ayala, who collaborated with Michael on the design front to make this project a reality. This is the fifth and last of our online artist projects, which includes Obituaries of the American Dream by Lisania Cruz, Somos Podemos by Ponceli Criación, Sé que fue así porque estuve ahí by Jimmy Izquierdo Ugaz, and The Race Survey by Collective Magpie. These are very distinct projects that have in common the use of internet as public space for sharing experiences and experiencing artworks collectively. During the pandemics, the internet is helping us to be together in the lead up to the show next March at El Museo. The Wall is a piece that reflects on the border crisis at the same time as it speaks of our intimacy with digital images. They appear in the practice of Michael expanding his narratives from printmaking to animation and installations. While video games inform the visual language here, we can also situate this work in a long lineage of political art that uses graphic narratives in spaces saturated with information. So tonight, in the first part of the program, we'll premiere this iteration of the work and watch the whole 13 minutes of the video. And this will be followed by a conversation between Michael and Claudia, moderated by Susanna Temkin. We encourage you to use the Q&A function of the webinar to share your questions. Enjoy the program, and thank you again.
Donald Trump wants more than a wall. The president, once again, has created his own reality, manufactured a crisis, invented an invasion, criminalized immigrants, made up facts and argued for a new wall at the United States-Mexico border. Mr. Trump is not the first president to ask for money for a wall. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush built fences and walls along the southern border. Barack Obama maintained the resulting system of roughly 700 miles of physical barriers. So why don't we want Mr. Trump to build his wall? What is different? The difference is that Mr. Trump's wall is a symbol of hate and racism, it would be completely useless, and it does not address any national emergency. The $5.7 billion requested by the Trump administration to build 234 more miles of walls and fences would be an enormous waste of time and money. Beginning with the first 14-mile stretch of border fencing, built between San Diego and Tijuana in the early 1990s, undocumented immigrants of Shome can adapt very fast and move to areas with no border barriers. Deserts in Arizona and open areas along the Rio Grande in Texas are now a favorite point of entry. The same thing would happen with a new Trump wall. We also know that almost half of all undocumented immigrants arrive by plane or with a visa. They come legally as tourists or visitors and simply overstay their visas. The tallest fence cannot stop that. Nor would a new wall prevent the flow of illegal drugs entering the country, as Mr. Trump claimed in his speech. Most drug seizures happen at ports of entry, and as long as we have more than 28 million Americans regularly using illegal drugs, we will have drug dealers in Mexico and the rest of Latin America moving their products to the most profitable market in the world. The wall has become a symbol of hate, racism and fear, says at Georgia Ramos News, in response to President Trump's calls for a wall on the southern border. The White House claims that 4,000 suspected terrorists were arrested along the southern border last year. That is simply wrong. A vast majority were detained at airports. Just 6 were actually caught crossing illegally by foot. I have recently traveled to the border in California and Texas, and I can report that contrary to what the president said in his speech, there is no invasion. The undocumented population has not grown in a decade, in fact it has fallen to 10.7 million. And despite the presence of violent drug cartels on the Mexican side, the American border towns are among the safest in the country. What is undeniable is the humanitarian crisis in Tijuana. But it is a crisis created in part by Mr. Trump. Record numbers of desperate families, fleeing violence, corruption and extreme poverty, have been arriving in caravans to our southern border. Instead of their asylum requests being promptly processed, as established by international and United States laws, only a few are allowed in every day. This policy of cruelty by design has unjustly affected children and the most vulnerable people in our hemisphere. These refugees certainly do not pose a danger to our national security. There is no need for a new wall, except, of course, in Mr. Trump's mind. The closest he got to building his wall was in January 2018, when Democratic senators negotiated a compromise for a wall in exchange for legislation on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Then the White House unexpectedly walked away from the deal. Would the Democrats revisit the offer? Luis Gutierrez, who recently retired from the House of Representatives after 26 years, once explained to me that it was like paying a ransom for a kidnapping. It will put the Democrats in a moral dilemma, protect the dreamers, maybe including siblings and families, And then, there is the racist thing. The wall has become a metaphor to Mr. Trump and his millions of supporters. It represents a divide between us and them, a physical demarcation for those who refuse to accept that in just a few decades, a majority of the country will be people of color. This is about more than just a wall. Mr. Trump promised it in 2015, in the same speech in which he announced his candidacy, the same speech in which he called Mexican immigrants rapists, criminals and drug traffickers. His goal was to exploit the anxiety and resentment of voters in an increasingly multicultural, multi-ethnic society. Mr. Trump's wall is a symbol for those who want to make America white again. The chant "Build that wall, build 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 that wall" became his hymn, and an insult not just to Latinos but also to all people who do not share his xenophobic ideals. The wall went from a campaign promise to a monument built on bigoted ideas. That is why most Americans cannot say yes to it. Every country has a right to protect its borders, but not to a wall that represents hate, discrimination and fear. No, Mexico will not pay for the wall, and it seems Congress won't either. But the concept of America as an unwelcoming country to immigrants and uncomfortable for minorities is already here. In a way, Mr. Trump already got what he wanted. He is the wall. The president, once again, has created his own reality, manufactured a crisis, invented an invasion, criminalized immigrants, made up facts and argued for a new wall at the United States-Mexico border. Mr. Trump is not the first president to ask for money for a wall. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush built fences and walls along the southern border. Barack Obama maintained the resulting system of roughly 700 miles of physical barriers. So why don't we want Mr. Trump to build his wall?
Hi everyone, this is Susanna Temkin. I'd like to invite my panelists, artist Michael Menchaca and curator Claudia Zapata, to rejoin our conversation today. And just to clarify, we are showing you only a portion of the wall, and you can go back and visit it and watch the video in full at heisthewall.net following our conversation, but we wanted to make sure that we left plenty of room for all of us to speak. And Elia Alba, our co-curator, and Rodrigo Mora are back as well. So just to get us started, I wanted to comment a little bit about the experience of watching the wall, which to me has such a visceral effect. And I hope that after you all heard the sound of Jorge Ramos's text that's being repeated to you over and over in this robotic voice, seeing the graphic design that Michael custom built for the wallpaper, as well as experience the animation, you have a sense of just how strong and multi-layered this piece is. But before we start to dive into all of those layers and contexts, I wanted to give us all maybe a bit of a breather and to talk to Michael first, and to hear a little bit about your formation as an artist, Michael, and some of your early influences and what has built up into this really cumulative project that you're still engaging with.
Yeah, so this video is a response to the xenophobic campaign that the current president ran on. When he spoke of an invasion coming to the US, he created a racialized image in the minds of Americans meant to inspire fear and to justify inhumane acts against the other. And so I realized that people already have a preconceived way of thinking about the immigration issue. And I've always tried to transport the viewer into different kind of experience on recurring Chicano themes in the context of artwork. So I'm not necessarily interested in working within the conventions that Chicano art has already taken, but rather trying to introduce my perspective as a semi-assimilated millennial Mexican American who grew up in Texas. And for me, what that means is video games provided the comfort of escapism as a kid. And so I looked to the flashy graphics that video games often have, and the larger than life characters and the glitches that occur, the stop motion properties, to try to incorporate that language and try to expand on the ways that Latinx people in this case, the migrant's journey and the enemies that they encounter are depicted.
Yeah, when we keep talking over the course of the development of this project, Michael, and well, Claudia, you're also from Texas, but for me, Michael, you and I think we're the same age, and so we have a lot of the same references of playing with Nintendos, playing with also merging from that 8-bit graphic style animation to much more sophisticated big tech is how you describe it in your biography, and how we see references to things like, you know, the Google location marks. But can you talk to us a little bit more about, you know, some of these early references? Let me go ahead and pull up our slideshow as we're speaking so that people have a reference as well. Because you mentioned these two were in particular references that you look to as part of your practice, correct?
Yeah, so looking at these two pictures, on the left is a game called Final Fight, and it really looks like the way that space is depicted, it's using vertical spacing. So like the same scale of figure on the lower part of the screen is assumed to be in the foreground or like closer to the screen. And then the characters that move up in the screen sort of look like they're receding like in the background. And so I use that same kind of effect when I'm making my animations. I like to work with those conventions because it's very similar to ancient manuscripts, the European manuscripts that showed like saints and holy scenes in a very similar way. So I think there's this back and forth going on between ancient representation and how video games and technology with their limits on what they could do with an interactive game, how they define space in a similar way. And on the right is it's a X-Men arcade game, and again it's the same kind of spacing of information, and sort of you see like there's a perspective kind of included on the top, and I try to incorporate that with some of my more recent prints and more recent animation work. But I think these two images give a sense of that kind of influence that video games have on my work.
And I want to bring in Claudia a bit about this, because you already started talking about not only how you were looking to these video games, but how you were seeing references with these ancient manuscripts, Michael. And Claudia, I know that's your background and your expertise, as well as in larger print histories. So I didn't know if you wanted to make some comments on this. And I think this idea of translation between media and maybe time as well, that's evident in your practice.
Right, I also wanted to mention that Michael and I are very similar ages too, and we grew up in the same neighborhood. And so we actually know the same arcades and things. So I think really situating the experience of the arcade is really important to thinking about time and thinking about multiplayer usage and this kind of like performance of playing as well. So in terms of kind of combining with the ancient world, you're really thinking about time, and you're thinking about narration, and you're thinking about this sequence of events that's occurring in a specific patterning of time. And because when you think about the ancient world, it seems very broad and almost ambiguous, but it's actually very finite. There's like, and it really translates to thinking about like digital things or the binary. Like it's very meticulously constructed narration of history. So I think these specific games, definitely like kind of 90s-ish games, have that feel to moving forward. I mean, any type of like allegory, you know, there's a protagonist and antagonist, there's specific characters. So a lot of the same ways of just storytelling translate across all these different forms of manuscripts and video and so forth. So I think it also attests to all the experiences Michael has had as being from Texas, Chicano, and then studying the ancient world as being in kind of an older millennial as well. It's a very specific time where you weren't all digital, so you kind of remember that moment, and it wasn't there was still like a social aspect to experiencing text such as this.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering too, and maybe this can help us move into the next slide, but like much as the same as we think when we are looking at codices, or I think also Egyptian hieroglyphics, you know, they are worlds unto themselves. And if you were an ancient Egyptian or an ancient Mayan, when you would see these texts or murals, you would automatically be able to interpret some of the context behind it. And I think that's also evident in video games. So like ideas of bosses, of leveling up. I think like we see on these two images, you know, the scroll bar at the top, and I think I'm not even using the right, probably video game language, but where you see, you know, power up or how many lives you have left. Some of those things you're incorporating into your practice. But to maybe continue to going backwards in your career, Michael, did you start doing animation, or no, you started as a printmaker, right?
Right, yeah, I started as a printmaker, and before that I was studying graphic design. So I had already an understanding of how to make illustrations work on the screen. But for me, what I wanted to do around 2010, so 10 years ago, I had this feeling of cultural alienation, or an awareness of the cultural alienation I felt towards my Mexican heritage as I was studying as a graphic, or as a printmaking student at Texas State in San Marcos. And I had these experiences of feeling racialized by my peers. And that was the first time that I felt what social anthropologists call a cultural cringe, where you have this internalized like inferiority complex that says that your cultural heritage and your cultural your family's cultural heritage is somehow inferior to the American identity. And so I wanted to challenge that kind of idea embedded within me and try to reclaim my identity as an American. And I looked to these to ancient codices, the ancient Mexican manuscripts, to try to find a language that I wanted to pair with my upbringing and my influence of these video games. So looking at this print, what I did was I was looking to combine mid-century modernist cartoons that also played an influence on me, like Hanna-Barbera cartoons and Tom and Jerry, and really combine that with this, or use those references to reframe the conversation around migration coming from Latin America going to the US. And so I had this cat symbol that I decided to use to represent Latinx bodies. And yeah, I guess I can explain about the cat.
So I know we were talking about the cat earlier, and it's such an interesting story.
Yeah, so cats I discovered as the symbol for Latinos when I started to talk to my mom, who was feeding cats in the neighborhood. I was talking about them as a strain on us financially, because we couldn't afford to keep feeding them and they were going to multiply. And so that coincided with the rise of anti-immigration legislation that was happening in 2010 when I started making this work. And so I connected those dots of immigrants and cats having similar life conditions. And so I started to build this narrative around cats and their struggle to try to escape into a better world and a better condition for their lives. And that's when I started to represent them in this way. So I designed these screen prints on a computer using Illustrator, which is a graphic design program where I can lay out graphics and have them be the same size that they end up being printed at. So I had to create several layers of information, which would all be separated and burned onto the screens in order to create the image that I created on the computer. So it's several layers of screens, each one printing a color of ink, and then laid out to be perfectly registered one on top of the other to create that image that you see in front of your screen.
Even that idea of the burned screen is so interesting, like talking about translating between different media, because, you know, when you play video games, there's also that concept of the burned screen. If, you know, a certain form appears for too long on the screen, you can actually create that, you know, residue that never goes away. At least I think on the old, maybe today's TVs don't do that as much, but it's so interesting that we can talk about screen printing and once again relate it back to videos. Before we move, I'm going to move us to the next slide, but I just wanted to point out the name of this piece is Castigo con sus amigos encima del tren, or Castigo, who's one of your characters or your avatars that we see again and again and who appears in the current version of the wall. And I mean, would you say in a way this is a prototype, or that it shaped the train, La Bestia, that we were seeing a bit in the wall, the animation that we all just experienced?
Yes, definitely. Early on in this work, as it was developing, I was looking at different scenes that could reflect the struggle of migrants as they move north from Latin America. And definitely I was understanding how important La Bestia was to that experience. And so looking at a train sequence to be included in the series of prints that I called the Codex Migratus, definitely I wanted to have a train represented. But also there's another struggle, another setting was the Rio Grande, and seeing how cats may struggle, or how people struggle to gain access to the U.S. And risk their lives by crossing the river. And so I had this scene depicted in that series, and sort of playing with the different illusions that can be done by making it seem like the bodies of the cats are falling within the paper. So playing with different kinds of registration techniques to block out certain parts of the cat's bodies and look like it's within the paper.
And I just want to mention to our audience that we do have a chat function and a Q&A function enabled in this webinar. So please feel free to submit any questions or comments you have for us, and we'll be sure to get to it before the end of the event. But before we move on from these two, I wanted to invite Claudia to maybe be able to speak a little bit more, because these prints are in the collection of the institution that you're working at, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, among a rather large body of Michael's works as well. If you can tell us a little bit about that and your current project.
Yeah, I also want to mention that every time someone sees these prints, they almost forget about this kind of violence that subsumes the composition. So everybody that sees this work is always like, oh, the kitties. And so they kind of forget that the cats are, some of them are drowning, and then the bestia, some of them are losing limbs and things like that. But it's definitely a sought after body of work. And luckily we worked with the collectors, Gil Cardenas and Dolores Garcia, and the Romos, Harriet and Ricardo Romo, and they donated several of Michael's work because they've been following Michael for a while. And both of them are Texas-based collectors. Gil was in the Midwest at one point, but Romo was in San Antonio area, and a very central Texas support system has always followed Michael, I think, since he was at Texas State. And I remember his work when it was in the Young Latino Artists exhibition at Mexicarte in Austin, Texas. So we've kind of seen this progression of the project in terms of this kind of multiplicity of these icons and these kind of variations and the interpretations of these images and these avatars, which very much translate to video games, which is, it's great that it went to the video form, because you're always kind of, once you gain certain points and certain amount of money, you can change someone's skin, literally, like you can change an avatar's clothing and so forth. And I think a really good image I remember seeing it once was of Michael's workstation, and he had created all these different types of characters. So it's really very much like kind of thinking about The Simpsons and thinking about the world of Springfield. And he definitely has that feel of making, even though they're very similar looking cats, they all kind of have their own an identity. And I think this is the beginnings of that with these earlier works. So we received those donations and we wanted to feature them prominently in the exhibition. So the exhibition is Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to now, through the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it's a permanent collection exhibition. So all these works are housed at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So we have them forever, and we'll be the stewards of his work. And so the way that they're featured in the exhibition also includes an additional animation overlaid on top of them, but primarily we're featuring the early beginnings of Michael's body of work.
And that show, I mean, I think we're going to continue to talk about it as we continue our conversation, but that show is opening very soon, right?
Right, November 20th until August 8th, 2021.
Excellent. I know, I'm very excited. I want to, actually, I'm going to skip this with your permission, Michael, and maybe we can come back to it. But I wanted to pick up on what you were just mentioning, Claudia, about the violence that is almost easy at some moments to forget, or maybe it becomes more digestible to us in these different formats. I think not only the video game or the gaming animation type format, but also in sort of the more cartoon-like images that we were just seeing. And you mentioned The Simpsons. I mean, there's the Itchy and Scratchy show that's embedded inside The Simpsons, which is, you know, already making so much fun of the violence that we see and we just accept in something like a Tom and a Jerry. And, you know, looking through your body of work, Michael, I noticed that you really tackle, I mean, not just the difficult subject of migration, but you've tackled things like lynching. And I'm curious your thoughts about how you're able to translate such, I mean, really, really difficult and heavy imagery, and how you turned to this particular aesthetic to do that.
Yeah, I think it was out of grievance to try to present the work with levity and have humor embedded in some of the imagery, because around that time, just on a personal note, my older brother had just passed away at the beginning of 2010 before I started doing this work. So I had this feeling like I had to incorporate some of my brother's sense of humor into my new work. And so this was the first kind of work that I started doing as a student at that time. Was like, I was starting to feel like I needed to put his spirit into a new practice. And so looking at horrible images and horrible story, like you know, news reports that were very difficult to read, thinking about how to translate that into an image where a viewer was going to not be turned off by the presentation of that story, but instead sort of like as a Trojan horse, like presented as like a fun graphic that pulls you in. And then so that's the initial reaction. Then when they read into it, they'll start to understand there's more going on. And so I wanted to have like this dual meaning that reflected this double consciousness that people of color always have about themselves, seeing themselves through their own eyes, but then also through the oppressor's eyes.
And do you want to, you were telling us a little bit about this work in particular, which again, we can all, having just watched the video animation, see how it relates. But again, you mentioned you started working on this in 2010. And
yeah.
please take it away.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
This was the second version of doing a train image in a screen print. And so after I presented my work to my peers in my screen printing class at Texas State, that initial train, Castigo on the train, then I went with this one, Castigo's Travels, to show a range in my different kind of work. So I wanted to show a messy screen print. Like I can also draw, guys, like that kind of thing. And this was like a midnight session in the studio, and I really fastly and crudely drew with a Conte crayon on a sheet of acetate or sheet of clear plastic that I then burn onto a screen. And then that exposure ended up becoming the stencil for the screen. So what I was trying to do is depict a different version of that same image of the cat on a train. And so with this, I was looking at cartoons, as I was mentioning, as a reference point. Tom and Jerry has this Mammy character where she's the maid of the house, and you only see her feet depicted, and she's usually scolding Tom, or Thomas, as she calls him. And I wanted to bring back that kind of human to animal relationship to the work early on. So in the context of this as an animation, I thought about having the feet signifying the idea of manifest destiny and its right to claim territory for itself. And so I revisited this print for looking to animate that sequence for the wall.
And I think, sorry, I don't mean to jump around, but I feel like we talked earlier about, so you were working on this body of work since 2010. And then at what point did you create the animation? It's a 3-channel animation. Actually, perhaps I should go back to this image first. This is an earlier iteration of what we just watched, or it's the full 3-channel iteration of what we just watched. And here we're seeing it as it was presented at the American University, the Katzen Center for the Arts, just last year. So can you continue to expand on this moving between different media? And then maybe we can bring in the Jorge Ramos text that I just flashed on the screen briefly.
Yeah, so in 2015, I was at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and that's where I started to create several animated sequences reacting to the campaign of the 45th president to be, and starting to make these various clips, and ended up what I did for the wall in 2019 was collect those clips that I had done and piece them together to create this 3-channel video installation that would be presented at the Katzen Center in DC. And so again, trying to transport the viewer into like a different kind of space to think about Latinx identity. I was thinking about 3-channel videos not yet being accepted as, or not being seen as a medium that one can express Chicano ideas or themes. And so that really made me want to work with that kind of presentation and build something that would fit on that platform, because starting at the Fine Arts Work Center is when I started to merge screens to play one animation. So like figuring out that hardware was a difficult step to achieve for me. Like I don't know how easy it is for other video artists, but I lacked the resources for that kind of tech stuff. So I had to like really do a lot of work to research hardware that works and is compatible with what I have to use. So once I got it figured out, I'm like, okay, let me just start designing for a really, really widescreen presentation. So this is you seeing, in this installation, you see the entirety of the animation. So for the online version, you're seeing 1/3 of the animation. So I'm sort of like panning and scanning through the animation to focus on certain aspects.
And can you remind us, was there the audio component for this particular version, or when did that come in?
No,
Really,
no, that's a good point.
audio.
Yeah, so the audio wasn't included for this iteration. It was just the visuals that I had. I was finishing up the video at Mass MoCA in the spring of 2019. And I think this went on display in April 2019. And so the sound came after I exhibited the work, got some reactions from the audience, and started to realize that some of the idea of the wall, thinking about that phrase, thinking about how what could accompany the visuals for this. And I was looking at or revisited Jorge Ramos's piece that he published during the government shutdown over the funding for the border wall. I had bookmarked it. I had considered it important to my research. And of course, what struck me was the title of the text. And it hadn't occurred to me that he himself could be a personification of the very thing that he has been after since he began campaigning. So in that sense, like, he is the wall. He also is the 1924 Immigration Act. He is the Willie Horton ad. Like, he's a lot of things. And so thinking about that text, one day in the studio, I had copied and pasted that text into a Word document and had my computer read it back to me in this robotic voice. And I had it playing over and over again, along with other like music that I was listening to, and had that sort of like faded in the background. I remember feeling almost hypnotized by the repetition of the text and how the voice lacked any emotion, even though it's very opinionated, what he's saying or what the text is saying. So I recognized that there was a life, that it could have a life of its own, the sound. But then after a few sessions in the studio, listening to it on repeat like that, I felt like it would be a good companion piece to have with the video that I had just finished.
And just to reiterate, when you're watching, when you all go back to the website to watch the wall, there's an interesting lack of synchronicity between the animation and the audio, because the animation continues and the audio just starts to repeat and to create that kind of like zombie drone-like sensation. But there is a moment that in the text, it says, build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. And it creates that sense of glitch that both of you mentioned earlier. And of course, I think many people are familiar with Legacy Russell just issued her book, Glitch Feminism. And so this idea of the glitch and the error as something powerful, I think is very much in the air right now. And I'm wondering if either of you wanted to talk about that at all.
Well, I think it was interesting that the first thing that struck me was the accent of the robot, that it had this, it reminded me of all of the enemy soldiers in like Star Wars and like, why are they British? And this kind of, and that leads me to this article I remember reading about the Jim code, which people are calling, in terms of the tech industry, this racialization that still exists obviously in the tech industry. For example, like when artificial intelligence and certain cams can't read darker skinned people, or certain algorithms are used against marginalized communities. And this idea of what perfection sounds like, or what's allowed to be this voice of reason, and how does one, in terms of like being an engineer, how does one construct that? So I thought that was really interesting, because Jorge Ramos has an accent, and this idea of, because if you go back to like ancient texts, if you think about how they're activated, they're very much performed. So they're in the voice of the community, And so this idea that the voice of technology sounds nothing like Jorge Ramos. And I think that was really interesting. And this kind of glitch that you're talking about, that was the only time I felt like I was listening to a machine. All the other time, I think I could get around that because at this point, your ear is attuned to this kind of technological lens and this technological dialect. So if, like, for example, you were talking to someone like over FaceTime or on Zoom, and there's like it also reminds me of Wayne's World 2 when they're at this kind of drive-through and they try to mess up the system speaker and they kind of break in and break out. And that's really what's happening, I think, a lot with Zoom, and this kind of concept of gestalt is happening where you're able to fill in. And so I think that at this point, we're becoming okay with that. We're becoming okay with the glitch. And that's now part of a technological dialect that at this point everyone understands in terms of like Western world and access to hardware and software. So I think it's a really interesting, I would call it a dialect, a technological dialect. I don't know if that there are like papers around that, but I'm sure there is. There's a lot about Siri and being a woman and things like that. This kind of like what is the voice of access to technology. So I think that says so much, and it's unseen. So if you're seeing a still of this work, this voice, it cannot be translated to a still image like the print, for example. It has to be experienced and activated and performed by technology. And it's largely unseen. I think that's the most interesting part of this work, is that omniscient voice that carries throughout the narration.
Yeah, just to thanks for that insight, Claudia. Just to elaborate like on my decision on choosing that particular voice, I chose a South Asian accent to read the text. I tried different ones, but I felt like the South Asian one connected brown bodies, and thinking about the caste system in India and how there's a similar kind of range of, or a similar hierarchy that India has, whereas there's also one in the US, but it's largely unspoken of. But how that kind of voice could connect the dots of colonial histories.
That's also interesting that you mentioned that, Michael, because you know, we've been saying how both of you, Claudia and Michael, have a similar trajectory, being from Texas. I think obviously the wall has become a national issue that I think everyone is very well attuned to, but you know, perhaps it's particularly resonant from where you're from. But I wanted to mention that just this week, there was another Zoom event with Juana Valdez, where she's also dealing with issues of migration, but she's Miami based. And so the way that she has been working with this trope is through the sea. And I think it's very interesting. There's a tension, I think, between our wanting to read these issues very regionally and to cite them specifically on the border in Miami, in the Caribbean, and that can also be quite dangerous to not make those linkages that you just made, Michael, to bringing in this history of colonialism that's really throughout the globe, and to really start to think about it more holistically instead of always somewhere where coincidentally often many of us are not. So I know we are getting short on time, but I do want to talk a little bit about Claudia, your project, and also I don't know if we have any questions from the audiences that we should get to, but Claudia, just to point out that with your show, I mean, it's a historical show, and I think it's really interesting that you and E. Carmen Ramos are tracing this history, not only, I mean, dating back to 1965 is your baseline year, but bringing it up to the contemporary moment through artists like Michael. And I'm curious, I just pulled a few of the images that I believe will be featured in the show that I felt like had specific resonance with some of what we just watched tonight. If you wanted to expand, or Michael, I'm really curious what you think about being cited with some of these amazing artists.
Sure. So E. Carmen Ramos is the curator of Latinx art at Smithsonian American Art Museum. So I was hired to support her in curating the shows. I'm the curatorial assistant. And we, over the last couple of years, have been going across the US and looking at print centers and studios and it's like planes, trains, and automobiles, looking at the best and the best of printmaking and kind of expanding on the common framework that most exhibitions of this kind do, because at this point it's very much like an eclipse. It happens every 10 years maybe. So there's so much that's gone on since the last one. And so these two prints are interesting because Esther Hernandez is a very iconic feminist Chicana artist. And the Sun Mat is one of her, you see, there's only like a canon and grouping of Chicano and Chicana artists, and at this point Chicanx artists, who people look to and they kind of know these are the iconic ones. Rupert and Esther both. Sun Mat is that one that you always see on the book covers and everything. It's always the one that people gravitate towards. And what's interesting about that one is she has another one called Sunray that she made in 2008 through Serie Project in Austin, Texas. So we showed these artists going back to these images and kind of updating them to the current moment. So that one is, the next one is about Sunray. So Sun Mat is about the pesticide use and the agribusiness, which is a common trope amongst Chicano artists and Chicano artwork since the 1960s in UFW and Cesar Chavez. And there's one to the right, Rupert Garcia, Ses Interpretación. That one's really interesting. And so many are very interesting in the show because they are as if they were made yesterday. Unfortunately, so many of these issues are just as pertinent as they were in the 70s and the 60s as they are now. And this one's interesting because it was reprinted with the group Dignidad Rebelde. So it's Melanie Cervantes and Jesus Barraza from the Bay Area. So we're definitely showing these kind of mentorship linkages that are happening, because a lot of times people think about Chicano art living in a very specific moment and it's kind of like, that's it. But there's these multi-generational overlays of mentorship through print centers, being in the same region, all these networks that exist. And so this one in particular, we wanted to highlight in the credits specifically that this was a reprint in collaboration with this group that continues this legacy of the printmaking, of Chicano printmaking, but now there's a younger generation that's not necessarily getting rid of its elders, it's working with and being influenced and continue to be influenced. And I think the younger generation showcases all the different abilities they have in terms of like technological aspects and digital strategies. And that's something that didn't exist before in certain shows because just certain technologies weren't available. And so this kind of evidence of that body of work is now available, and we recognize that in the show. So 1965 to now, that's so long, but it's very much a testament to the legacy of the term and the body of work and this artistic movement that some categorize as ending as a certain time. But in terms of presenting the show, we definitely showcase on the contrary that people are still using that term, people are still identifying that, and people are still using several of the themes that are addressed since the 1960s. So it's definitely there's a lot of echoing and conversation amongst one another, literally and physically with the objects.
And Michael, we have a question on that line about what are your interests in political art and what do you trace as some of your, artistic and historical lineages in your own work?
Yeah, so definitely the codices, I would say, talking about like ancient influence. More recently, artists like Enrique Chagoya I was looking at when I was first starting to make the work, because I realized that he was also influenced by codices in his prints, but I didn't want to like do the same thing. So I was thinking a challenge at that point was like, how do I make artwork that has a similar influence and has like a political kind of message or mentality. So trying to look at those influences, and you know, now I get to exhibit alongside them, which is crazy. Looking at Luis Jimenez too, which is also, he's also in the show, and thinking how crazy that is to show with them. But early on, looking really closely at the Mixtec codices and how I could work with metaphor in a figurative sense, and try to combine multiple definitions for a certain character or a certain symbol, and repurpose textures that came from the original artisans, and repeat them perfectly with like a computer program. And you know what that would do, like having that density of a consistent line width throughout an entire composition, how that reads is like a computer did it, which is striking, because the original codices, they didn't have computers, but yet they were so consistent with their drawing technique. So yeah.
And I wanted to, I know we're getting past time, and I really don't want to necessarily end it on this note, but of course tonight is another debate, and this work where the website is He Is the Wall. And I was joking with Michael, it reminds me of Lord Voldemort a little bit, not saying the name, but the presence of him throughout the piece. And so I'm curious, Michael, again, having worked on this for so long, through the presidency of number 45, I'm curious what your take is on showing this right now.
Yeah, so over the years, I've drawn different iterations of the president, and I think he makes at least 4 or 5 different appearances in the animation. But I really wanted to just give people a space online to rethink the last 4 years or 5 years, if you count his campaign, and think about it, what that's done to your subconscious of hearing this kind of nativism resurface, and how it's emboldened certain people to you know, do violent acts, and just bring out the worst of the country's history, and yeah, just to give a place to meditate on that.
And I think, I mean, I'd invite both of you if you have any final words, but I just wanted to mention again, if you visit the website, something that's specific to this iteration of the wall is that it's looping. And so in a sense, there is no end to it, which I think is also metaphoric about this topic of migration, that we are talking maybe about a particular wall, but I think it's much more extensive than, again, just this moment. Sorry, we have one last question from someone who's asking if there are particular segments of the border wall that you had in mind when you were creating this piece.
Not specifically. Going by what the video game designers have done, is they present things very like a simplified version of a setting, which you know, locates a scene in a region, or like in a specific continent or country. So I was following along that kind of you know, idea of having the setting be more general, but you still get the idea that this is, based on the context of like what's happening with the characters and who's on the screen, you get a sense of like where it's at. And the way I use the pattern in the back, how it's like constantly forming, folding into itself, and sort of like doing this fractal kind of animation. I use that as a symbol of imperialism, and how that speaks to, because it's an eagle feather, that it speaks to the complexities of how eagle feathers or eagles have been used symbolically between US and Mexico. But no, not a specific location.
Thank you. I think maybe the eagle feather, in a way, it's a good ending point, because I think it just points to the fact that there's your work. It's so detailed. It's so complex. There's so much that we could dig into. Each character, I think, has all of these levels to be read into it, from pop cultural references to history to art history. So again, I want to thank both of you. This was a really great conversation. I feel like we could go on and on.